On the night of July 24th, 1987, 30-year-old Susan Woods stood at the entrance to a local fair in a little city called Hico, located in central Texas, along with her best friend and her best friend's boyfriend. And the three of them were standing there trying to decide if they wanted to continue to stay here or leave. Now, as they're standing there, they can hear people having fun on all the rides. There's kids laughing and they're screaming. I mean, it's a Friday night. They had chosen to come here. This was the activity. But, so far the night had really not been that great. So Susan's best friend, whose name was Cindy Hallmark, and her boyfriend, whose name was Roy Hayes, had convinced Susan to come out with them and come to this fair because Susan's life of late had been really quite bad. She was in the middle of this very ugly divorce, and the new guy that she was dating had sort of wound up being very pushy when it came to physical intimacy, and so she had recently dumped him too, and so, Susan's life, certainly her relationships anyways, were sort of in rough shape. And so Cindy and Roy had convinced Susan to come out with them and just at least for one night, come enjoy this fair. Just forget about everything else and just come have some fun. And so Susan had agreed to go. However, sort of ironically, once they actually got to the fair and the three of them were walking around and playing games and going into the haunted house and doing all the things you do at the fair, it had been Cindy, not Susan, who had ultimately said that they weren't really having a good time, that they were feeling kind of bad. Cindy said that she just had this really intense feeling that something bad was about to happen. It was like this constant anxiety, and she couldn't shake it, and it was making it really hard to enjoy the night. And so that was why the trio is, standing at the gate, wondering if it's even worth staying here any longer. And ultimately, Roy finally just said, you know what, why don't we just leave and head back to Stephenville? That's where they all lived. It's where they grew up, too. And he said, why don't we go back to Stephenville and we'll just drive around for a bit and eventually we'll go to the Dairy Queen restaurant and we'll get some ice cream. And when Roy suggested this, both Susan and Cindy thought that was a great idea. And so they left, they hopped in Roy's truck, and they began the drive back to Stephenville. About an hour and a half later, Susan, Cindy, and Roy walked into the Stephenville Dairy Queen. They ordered ice cream sundaes and then sat down at a booth. By this point, Cindy's feeling of dread, that something bad was going to happen, had mostly gone away, and so the mood was much lighter. And Susan especially was actually having kind of a great night, the first in a long time it felt like. The last 6 months or so had been some of the worst in Susan's entire life. Her ex-husband, Michael Woods, who she had been with since she was in her early 20s, had effectively abandoned her back in February, taking her car and also some expensive crystals that she had collected, and he had left behind a viciously mean tape recording of all the things he hated about her, along with dozens of cruel notes with insults on them hidden all over the place. And so Susan had filed for divorce, and then instead of trying to get her car back from her husband, who was long gone, she just began doing a ton of overtime at the sandpaper factory in order to afford another car. And so in these few months immediately following the breakup with her ex and all this extra work she was doing, Susan had really fallen into a deep depression. But it had been Cindy and Roy who had helped kind of pull herself back together. Susan was naturally very shy, and she did not have a big social circle. But Cindy, on the other hand, was very extroverted, had a ton of friends and a lot of close cousins. And so she had persuaded Susan to begin coming to their regular meetups with all her friends and cousins. The core group that typically attended these meetups was Cindy, Roy, Cindy's cousins, Regina and Scott Hatley, and then maybe one or two others. And collectively, they referred to themselves as the members of the round table, because often these meetups consisted of just spending the whole night sitting around Cindy's round kitchen table, talking and drinking. The first time Susan had gone, it had seemed like such a tight-knit group that she really just kind of felt like a third wheel and did not belong. But everyone had really treated her like she did belong. And these days, she did not miss a meetup because this was like her new community. It really made her happy. And so slowly but surely, Susan had begun to feel better, largely because of these meetups. And so now, as she looked across the table at Cindy jokingly trying to force-feed Roy all this ice cream, Susan just smiled. Roy was this big guy, but he was losing the fight, and he had chocolate sauce all over his chin. They were just kind of goofing around. She just thought to herself, you know what? Tonight was a great night. My life, it's turning around. And suddenly, she had an idea. Susan stood up from the table, and without saying anything, she walked up to the counter, and she promptly ordered a second hot fudge sundae. And when she carried it back over to the table with a big grin on her face, Cindy and Roy kind of looked at her surprised, and were kind of impressed even, which was exactly the reaction that Susan was hoping for. Normally, Susan was very conscious of her weight and wouldn't even finish one sundae. But tonight, she just felt like, you know what? I have been set free. I'm just going to have fun. But unfortunately for Susan, the ice cream sundaes were really the last fun thing she got to enjoy that entire weekend, because she spent all day Saturday on the line at the sandpaper factory where she worked, and then all day Sunday she was grocery shopping, doing laundry, and straightening up the house. By about 8 p.m. Sunday night, she had put away all of her laundry, she had made the bed, and picked up the last few items off the bedroom floor. Her house was small, but it was finally starting to feel like hers again. When her ex-husband Michael had first left, even though he had gone 1,000 miles away to Indiana, she had felt afraid in her house, like he might suddenly come back. And so she'd actually had Cindy sleep over her house for a while to help her feel safe. And also she asked Roy to literally nail all her windows shut. But despite fortifying her living space, what Susan couldn't escape from were all these awful little notes that Michael had left behind and hidden all over the house. All these awful messages, just basically telling Susan all these terrible things about her and how much he hated her. She kept finding them all the time. But as of right now, the house was neat and tidy, and Susan by this point believed she had found, almost every note, or certainly close to every note. So, to celebrate, Susan headed over to the couch and sat down and turned on the TV. Her plan was just to watch a couple of shows and just enjoy the peace and quiet, and then go to bed, because tomorrow she would have to get up early for work. As she was sitting there, flipping through the channels trying to figure out what she wanted to watch, she heard a knock on the front door. Two days later, at 6 p.m. on the afternoon of July 28th, Susan's father, Joe Atkins, was at home when his phone rang. And when he picked it up, it was Susan's manager at the sandpaper factory, which was weird. The manager told him that he was calling because Susan had not shown up to work for the past 2 days, and nobody could get a hold of her. And so he was wondering if Joe knew where she was. Joe frowned and said no, he didn't know, but he would go find out. He hung up and he immediately dialed Susan's number. And when she didn't answer, he didn't think twice. He just put the phone down, grabbed his keys, hurried out to his truck, and started driving towards Susan's place. A half an hour later, Joe pulled up outside of Susan's house, and he went up to her front door. And when he knocked, nobody answered. But he could hear the TV on inside. And when he tried the doorknob, he found the door was unlocked. He opened the door up a little bit, and he poked his head inside, and he called his daughter's name. But he didn't get a response. So he stepped all the way inside. The house was basically clean, except there were snacks out on the coffee table, and the TV was still on, and it was on pretty loud. But also, there were some cigarettes that had been burned out in an ashtray on the coffee table, and Joe knew his daughter didn't smoke. And so at this point, everything told him something is wrong. So Joe walked through the living room and into his daughter's bedroom. And his daughter was not in there, but the bed was a mess. The sheets and the bedding had all been ripped off and were sitting in a heap on the floor, and the mattress itself was hanging off the box spring. Joe was about to leave and search the rest of the house when he noticed the bathroom door in the bedroom was open. Joe forced himself to step toward the door, and as he did, his heart began to hammer in his chest. And then, when he leaned around the door and looked inside the bathroom, he just froze. For what felt like a very long time, but was very likely only a few seconds, Joe didn't move or breathe. Then, it's like he broke out of his fog, he stumbled backwards, he ran to the living room, grabbed the phone, and he called 911. Sergeant Donnie Hensley of the Stephenville Police Department had just gotten home after a pretty long shift when he got a call from dispatch to head back out again. A homicide had just been called in, and every available officer had to head to the scene right away. The dispatcher did not have many details, but they did know that the victim was a young woman and that she had been found by her father inside of her home. When Hensley got to the address, he found there was an ambulance there and a couple of fire trucks and police cars and a whole bunch of police officers that were already out and about stringing up crime scene tape. But he also saw someone that he was not expecting to see. It was a friend of his, a guy he knew who volunteered at the town's golf course. His name was Joe Atkins. So he walked over and he asked Joe, like, "Hey, what are you doing here?" But the instant he asked that question, and when Joe turned around to look at him, Hensley understood why he was here. He suddenly remembered that Joe had a daughter, and based on the look on Joe's face, clearly his daughter was the murder victim. Joe had found her. Hensley was a hardened detective who had been to plenty of crime scenes by this point, and he had seen some terrible things. But the pure grief on his friend's face was too much for him to bear. He knew there was nothing he could do to take Joe's pain away. So instead, without saying anything, Hensley took Joe's hands, and the two men just stood there and prayed. And then after a few minutes, he let go of Joe's hands, and then he turned and walked up Susan's front steps to begin the search for her killer. The crime scene unit was already inside of Susan's home, hard at work, by the time Detective Hensley walked through the front door. A supervisor walked over and brought Hensley up to speed. They told him that Susan's body was in the bathroom, and from the looks of it, she'd been dead for a while. The front door had been unlocked, and there was no sign of forced entry, which suggested that Susan may have let her killer inside. Detectives were now dividing up the house into quadrants to examine each part of the crime scene, and Hensley would be working primarily in the bedroom. But the supervisor warned Hensley that the crime itself was incredibly brutal, likely bordering on torture, and he should just mentally prepare himself. Hensley nodded, and for a moment he just stood there and collected himself and took stock of the scene. He looked over at the coffee table in the living room, and he saw it was covered with snacks, including a bag of potato chips, a pack of Twinkies, and an open Coke can. And there was an ashtray with 6 cigarette butts inside of it. It looked like more food and more cigarettes than one person would reasonably consume, and so maybe Susan had had company. But otherwise, the house was clean and pretty unremarkable. Except for one thing that took Hensley a minute to notice. And what it was is all the windows were nailed shut from the inside. Susan clearly must have been scared of somebody breaking in. And so naturally, Hensley wondered if maybe the person she was scared of breaking in was the same person who wound up killing her. But if that was the case, why had she apparently opened the door for this person? At this point, Hensley moved into the bedroom. And as soon as he did, he could tell there had to have been a struggle in here, because the mattress was hanging off the box spring, the sheets had been pulled off, and they were heaped up on the floor, and there were all these scuff marks on the floor that suggested the bed very likely had been moved, dragged around inside of the room. There was also a white extension cord lying on the mattress, and also there was this pillow that had all these strange black smudges on it. Hensley walked over and looked at this pillowcase, trying to figure out what the smudges could be, and then he realized it was mascara. The pillow must have been held over Susan's face to suffocate her. But when Hensley walked into the bathroom and saw what was in there, despite the warning he was given about how brutal it was, he still was taken aback and found himself gasping. Susan's body was draped over the side of the tub, with her head still in the water. Her hands had been tied behind her back using the sleeves of her own shirt. But other than that shirt, she was naked. At first glance, it was obvious Susan was dead, because her head and shoulders that were underwater were severely decomposed from being in the water. And the water was dark from all the blood. There also were all these streaks of blood on the floor that made it look like Susan had been dragged to the tub. There was also a raw red line across Susan's throat, like she had been strangled by something, perhaps that electrical cord that had been out on the bed. And so at this point, Hensley realized that whoever murdered Susan had likely sexually assaulted her, strangled her, smothered her, and then held her body underwater. I mean, this had been a savage attack committed by a monster. However, Hensley also realized that this monster, whoever had done this, had made at least one mistake, because one of the crime scene techs that was in the bathroom was pointing at the tub with excitement. And when Hensley looked at what they were pointing at, you could see perfectly clearly there was a set of palm prints, almost certainly left behind by the killer. The following morning at around 10 a.m., Sergeant Hensley walked into the Stephenville police station and promptly filled up a paper cup from the bullpen water cooler and drank it down. It was over 90 degrees outside, and he had just spent all morning and a lot of the previous night canvassing the neighborhood where Susan had been murdered. But despite all their efforts, they really hadn't gotten much. Susan had been found on Tuesday, but nobody had reported seeing her on Tuesday or the Monday before or the Sunday before, which left a window of 3 days for this murder to have taken place. One of Susan's neighbors did remember seeing a, quote, large framed man park his truck near Susan's house on Sunday night, but that described a lot of the men in Stephenville, so that didn't really narrow anything down. Now, the police chief had not yet assigned a lead investigator to Susan's case, but because Sergeant Hensley knew Susan's father personally, he was hoping to stay involved. So after drinking a second cup full of water, Hensley headed down the hall to the chief's office, where he asked to see Susan's autopsy report. The chief's secretary handed it over, and Hensley quickly began to thumb through the pages. But he quickly realized there really was almost nothing here that he didn't already know. The report confirmed that Susan had been sexually assaulted, but her body was so decomposed, it was impossible to determine exactly how or when she had died, although the coroner estimated she'd been in the tub for roughly 2 days. But right at that moment, another investigator named Lieutenant Ken Maltby walked up and grabbed the report right out of Hensley's hands. And before Hensley could protest, Maltby walked back to the bullpen and rapped his knuckles on a door frame to get everybody's attention. Then Maltby announced that he would be taking over Susan's case, so everybody else, Hensley included, should back off. And Hensley did not like this, not only because, he had this closeness with Susan's father, but also because he had a feeling that Maltby was only interested in this case because he thought it would help his career. However, Maltby outranked Hensley, and Hensley already had a full caseload of work, so there really was very little he could do here. So, with a resigned sigh, he headed back to his desk. Two days later, around 2 p.m. on July 31st, Sergeant Hensley stood in the back of a small crowd, sweating through his suit, as Susan's casket was lowered into the ground. Hensley was at this funeral really to support Susan's father, Joe, because he was not really a part of the investigation. However, he couldn't help, scanning the mourners, through a detective's lens to see if anybody seemed suspicious. There was a group of people in their 20s and 30s that were standing towards the front, and Hensley assumed they must be Susan's friends. He remembered what one of Susan's neighbors had said about a large framed man, and he looked at all the men, taking note of their size. At the center of the group, there was a blonde woman who was sobbing, and Hensley recognized her as Susan's best friend, Cindy Hallmark, who was leaning on her boyfriend, Roy Hayes. The two of them had actually come to the crime scene by coincidence on the day Susan's body was found, and they had totally broken down when they realized what had happened. But now, Hensley was suddenly noticing just how physically enormous Roy was. And so in that moment, Hensley thought to himself, if he was in charge of this case, he knew Roy would be somebody he'd take a close look at. But that was not his decision. But then Hensley noticed that there was actually one person who was conspicuously absent from this funeral, and that was Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods. From what Hensley had heard around the station, nearly all of Susan's friends and family were convinced that it was Michael who was the killer. But there was a problem with this theory. Michael lived 1,000 miles away in Indianapolis, and word around the police station was that during that window of time where Susan was murdered over those 3 days, Michael was in Indianapolis, and he was around loads of people who would vouch for him being in Indianapolis, which meant that, as far as Hensley knew, there really was no way for Michael to be the killer. And so Hensley just hoped that Lieutenant Maltby had another, better suspect in mind. For the next few weeks, Sergeant Hensley focused on his own cases, while still keeping tabs on Susan's. Every couple of days, her dad would call him up and ask why Michael hadn't been arrested yet, and Hensley would always tell him that the case was in good hands and they're working on it. But as the weeks passed by with no arrests, Hensley started to wonder, what was going on here? Something needs to happen. Why is nothing happening? Then one day in early October, so roughly 2 months after Susan's murder, Hensley walked into the bullpen to find Maltby celebrating. Not because of any progress in the case, though, but to celebrate his big promotion. Maltby was going to be the lead of a new narcotics unit, and his open cases that he had been working on were just going to be, given to other investigators or filed away altogether. And so as Maltby accepted congratulations from other officers and just made a whole scene, all Sergeant Hensley could think was, well, what's going to happen to Susan's case? It could easily fall through the cracks here. And so without even talking to Maltby, Hensley walked straight to the chief's office and asked to take the case over. The chief shrugged and just said, sure, you're welcome to try, so long as this case does not get in the way of his other work. Hensley agreed and then went to get Susan's file, and then after he had it in hand, he hurried back to his desk and began rifling through the pages. And he was stunned to find that there was almost nothing in there besides the original autopsy report. And that's when Hensley remembered that Lieutenant Maltby claimed to have this photographic memory, and so he almost never took notes. And so Hensley was basically going to have to start all over from square one. At 9 a.m. the next morning, Sergeant Hensley sat down in the kitchen of Susan's best friend, Cindy Hallmark, as Cindy poured them both a cup of coffee, and then Cindy started talking. And she had a lot to say. She was absolutely convinced that Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods, was the killer, and she just could not understand why it was taking detectives so long to arrest him. Cindy said, for most of Susan and Michael's relationship, Michael was just kind of a loser. He couldn't keep a job, and he just lift weights and play guitar shirtless in the front yard. However, when they had broken up, Michael had recorded this totally unhinged audio recording about how awful Susan was and left it for Susan, along with all these notes he had hid all around the house and the property, which also just said terrible things about Susan. And this behavior by Michael had scared Susan so much that she had asked Cindy and Cindy's boyfriend Roy to help nail all her windows shut, specifically to prevent Michael from coming into the house. Hensley listened and wrote everything Cindy said down, but he really wasn't as sold on the Michael Woods theory as everybody else in Stephenville seemed to be. And that was primarily because the police in Indianapolis had spoken to Michael, and apparently he had given them a rock-solid alibi. And so realistically, it didn't make sense for him to be the killer. That said, Hensley was pretty confident that the killer had to be somebody Susan knew. The lack of forced entry, coupled with all the snacks and the Coke can and cigarettes on her coffee table, suggested that Susan might have entertained her murderer before they killed her. And so at this point, Hensley was much more interested in learning if there were other romantic interests in Susan's life, besides Michael. And when he asked Cindy that question, she said, yeah, there was one other guy. She said right before Susan was killed, she was seeing this bartender named J.C. Bauman. However, they'd only gone on a few dates. Cindy said that J.C. had put a lot of pressure on Susan to sleep with him, and so she had just broken up with him. And when Hensley heard this, he felt like this was really promising. And so when Cindy finished telling her J.C. story, he asked her if she knew where he could find J.C. And she said yeah, and she gave him the address of the bar where he worked. 45 minutes later, Sergeant Hensley pulled up in front of the bar. It was still too early for business, but there was a delivery truck out front, and there were a few men who were unloading kegs and bringing them inside. And so Hensley walked up to these guys, and he asked if any of them knew a J.C. Bauman. And this tall, bearded man raised his hand and said, actually, that was him. A few minutes later, Hensley and J.C. were sitting at the empty bar. Hensley watched J.C.'s face very closely as he explained to him that he was here to talk about Susan. J.C. nodded and ran his fingers through his hair like he was nervous. And then he said his throat was dry and asked Sergeant Hensley if he wanted something to drink. Sergeant Hensley said he was okay, but J.C. he got up, went behind the bar, and then came back with a can of Coke. And after sitting down and opening the drink up and taking a sip, J.C. also lit up a cigarette. And so immediately, Hensley thought of the Coke can that was on Susan's coffee table, as well as the ashtray full of cigarettes, despite the fact that Susan was not a smoker. And so the interview had barely even started, and Hensley was already very suspicious of JC. So he decided to push pretty early and see how JC reacted under some serious pressure. And so right out the gate, he asked JC where he was on Sunday, July 26th, which was the day investigators at this point believed Susan was murdered, based primarily on the autopsy report. And when JC was asked that, he swallowed and said he couldn't remember, which was possible. I mean, the murder happened 2 months earlier, but it didn't make JC look that good. So Hensley asked JC if it was true that he and Susan broke up ultimately because he, JC, had pressured her for sex. JC turned beet red and said he had never pressured Susan. He said they had been intimate, but just once in Susan's bathtub. And when Hensley heard this, he nearly dropped his pen. It seemed extremely suspicious that JC was claiming to have been intimate with Susan in the same bathtub where she was found dead. And so Hensley wondered if he was maybe trying to get ahead of the fact that his fingerprints would be found on or in that bathtub. Now, legally, Hensley knew he could not compel JC to offer up his fingerprints without charging him first. But he took a chance and just asked anyway. And to his surprise, JC said, "Yes, you can have my fingerprints." And he almost seemed relieved. He said, "Whatever you need to help solve Susan's murder, I'll do it." 2 hours later, Sergeant Hensley was back at his desk in the Stephenville police station looking at a card that had JC's finger and palm prints on it. And as he looked at it, he began thinking about those palm prints on Susan's bathtub. In 1987, fingerprints and palm prints were just much slower to process than they are today. And the closest lab that analyzed these prints was an hour and a half away in Fort Worth. And Hensley knew they were always working with a backlog, so his results could easily take months. But Hensley was not going to just sit around and wait, because he had one more suspect he wanted to talk to. The following afternoon, Sergeant Hensley walked into an interrogation room at the police station and sat down across from Roy Hayes, who was Susan's best friend, Cindy's boyfriend. Hensley wanted to speak to Roy for 2 reasons. One, he matched the physical description of the large man seen near Susan's house around the time of her murder. And 2, there just weren't that many people who were close to Susan. And Roy saw her when she was both with Cindy and also when she would attend those members of the Round Table get-togethers. Now, that was not that incriminating, but Hensley knew that catching the killer was as much about ruling suspects out as it was about ruling them in. So that was really all he was trying to do here with Roy, is just maybe find a way to say, nope, not him. But before Hensley could even begin asking Roy questions, Roy just started talking. He told Hensley that he had been thinking about Susan's case nonstop. He said that his mind had been running wild with all the possible ways the killer could have gotten inside. And so now Roy was eager to share his theories. After all, he said he was the one who nailed those windows shut, so he knew where the weaknesses in her house were. And so Hensley said, "Okay, let's hear your theories." And Roy began listing all the ways a person might be able to get inside of Susan's house, including what Roy said was the most promising, which was a 6-inch crack in the window above the kitchen sink. And as Roy did this, all of a sudden, he was at the top of Hensley's suspect list. And when Roy was done rattling off all the ways he would break into Susan's house, Hensley asked him, "Where were you on the evening of Sunday, July 26th? And Hensley watched as Roy's expression changed from very intense to surprised, as he realized he was now being asked for his own alibi. Roy started stumbling over another very long, rambly answer, and what he had to say ultimately just made him look even more guilty, because Roy told Hensley that on the night Susan was killed, he had been over at a friend's house playing a game called Dungeons and Dragons. So today, people know Dungeons and Dragons as a harmless fantasy role-playing game. But at this time in 1987, it was viewed very differently. In the late 1980s in America, there was this huge fear that certain games, books, and heavy metal songs were all linked to devil worship. The TV news ran regular stories across the country about how Dungeons and Dragons specifically encouraged players to cast spells and practice witchcraft. And the local paper in Stephenville had carried a full-page ad calling the game satanic. So when Roy told Hensley he had been playing Dungeons and Dragons on the night Susan was killed, Hensley immediately thought back to the horrible brutality of the crime scene. And he wondered if maybe Susan's murder could have been tied to some kind of dark ritual. And so Hensley looks at Roy and says, "Okay, well, are you prepared to give us your fingerprints?" And Roy said, "Yeah." A half an hour later, a very disappointed Sergeant Hensley watched Roy walk away from the station. Just like with JC, Roy had seemed incredibly suspicious at the start of the interview, but then he'd easily offered up his fingerprints like he wasn't concerned at all about whether they'd matched the killers. So Hensley was not sure what to expect in terms of results here. But he still sent Roy's prints off to the outside lab to be added to the queue behind JC's. Hensley was contemplating his next move when the station receptionist walked over and said that someone from the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department was on the line for him. They were following up on the inquiry he had made a few days earlier to double-check the alibi of Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods. Hensley eagerly ran to the phone, and when he heard what the officer had to say, he practically jumped out of his chair. Because according to the Indianapolis police officer, it was true that Michael said he had an alibi with lots of witnesses, but he had promised to provide the names and contact information for all those witnesses, and he had never done it. Which meant Michael's alibi, the same one Stephenville police used to rule him out as a suspect, or more specifically, they used the idea of his alibi, the belief that his alibi existed, that's what they used to rule him out. Well, clearly, it was totally unverified. Lieutenant Ken Maltby, who was in charge of the case when this decision was made, had just completely dropped the ball. Somebody had to check Michael's alibi. On a bright morning in April of 1988, Sergeant Hensley walked out of the Indianapolis International Airport with a single duffel bag of luggage slung over his shoulder. He was here to try to collect the fingerprints of Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods, who was now Hensley's primary suspect. Hensley had been trying to coordinate the investigation into Michael from Stephenville, Texas, but it had proven to be kind of cumbersome, and so he decided to just take matters into his own hands and actually go to Indianapolis. He knew Michael did not have to submit to fingerprinting unless he was charged with a crime, so Hensley had come up with a plan. He was going to put Michael under surveillance and wait for him to do something illegal. Maybe he gets into a fight or an altercation, or he buys some marijuana, or even jaywalked, anything. Hensley would use it as an excuse to arrest him and get his prints. For days, Hensley sat in an unmarked van outside the house where Michael lived, watching the front door through a telephoto camera lens. But Michael and his roommates seemed pretty boring. They barely even left the house. Hensley was beginning to think that his big plan to catch Michael doing something illegal was a huge waste of time. It just was not going to happen. But then one morning, he noticed some unusual activity in Michael's front yard. Michael and his roommates were laying out furniture and clothing on their front lawn, clearly getting ready for a yard sale. Sergeant Hensley was snapping photos of everything they were bringing out, and at one point, he saw something that gave him a rush of excitement. Because through his lens, he spotted these crystal figurines that appeared to be the exact same type of crystal figurines that Michael had allegedly stolen from Susan's house in Stephenville when their marriage had ended and he had left to go to Indianapolis. Hensley practically laughed out loud. I mean, this was too easy. This was his chance. So he called the local police, and they stormed the yard sale and they arrested Michael for theft. 2 weeks later, now back in Stephenville, Sergeant Hensley walked into the police station to start a shift, and he found a manila envelope waiting for him. It had a return address that said it was from the Texas DPS Crime Lab in Fort Worth, Texas, where he had sent all of the suspect's fingerprints. Hensley ripped open the envelope and dumped the contents onto the table, and as he began looking through them, he realized the lab had already analyzed all 3 sets of prints that he had sent in. They were Susan's ex-boyfriend, J.C. Bauman, her best friend's boyfriend, Roy Hayes, and her ex-husband, Michael Woods. Now, at this point, if Hensley had had to guess who the killer was, he would have guessed Michael, because Michael is this estranged ex-husband who had left behind these terrible recordings and notes, and he had spooked Susan so badly at the end of their relationship, she had nailed her windows shut to keep him out. And then also, his alibi was sort of up in the air. They didn't really know if he had one or not. They hadn't been able to actually verify it or not yet. JC also had basically no alibi. He drank Coke and he smoked cigarettes, just like the killer had left in Susan's living room, or is believed to have been the killer who left those behind. And Roy, in virtue of playing Dungeons and Dragons, could potentially be involved in Satanism. and also he seemed way too eager to talk about how he might break into Susan's house. However, for Hensley, he felt like one of these three men is the killer. He's about to get his answer. But as he read through each of these reports, he went from exhilaration to confusion, and finally just total disbelief, because none of these prints that he'd submitted matched the ones from Susan's tub. Hensley wanted so badly to solve this case, to give Susan's father Joe, his friend, some closure. But now, he felt like he was totally out of ideas. Susan's case ultimately went completely cold. Sergeant Hensley retired, and 19 years passed by. And then one day, in early 2006, Lieutenant Don Miller of the Stephenville Police Department took a box labeled Susan Woods down from a shelf in evidence storage, carried it back to his office, sat down at his desk, and began to look through its contents. Miller had recently been tasked with reviewing the department's unsolved cases, including Susan's. He read all of Sergeant Hensley's notes, he studied the crime scene photos, and he reviewed all the witness statements. None of it looked very promising. In fact, it looked like all the suspects had basically been ruled out. But then he saw those palm prints that had been lifted from Susan's bathtub, which had never been matched to anyone, and he had an idea. Back in 1987, there had been no centralized database of fingerprints. This meant that unless you had a specific suspect to compare an unknown prints against, the unknown print was effectively useless. And that's really what had happened in Susan's case. None of the suspects had matched this unknown print, so the case was put on a shelf. But in 2006, the FBI now had a national database of all the fingerprints of everybody in America who had ever been arrested and fingerprinted. And this meant that if Susan's killer had ever been arrested for any crime anywhere, their fingerprints would likely be in that database. Now, Lieutenant Miller did not have the budget or the time for a full-blown reinvestigation here, but he certainly had the time and money to just submit those prints into this FBI database to just see if there was a hit. So he submitted them and then put her case file back in storage. And sure enough, a few days later, Miller was at his desk when his phone rang, and it was the FBI, and they told him they had found a match. But when the FBI agent told Miller the name of the person whose prints these matched, it meant nothing to Miller. He didn't think he'd actually even heard the name before. And the person had been arrested for robbery in Nevada, not Texas. Miller thanked the agent, and he quickly began digging through this person's history, and he also went and got the Susan Woods case file. And slowly but surely, it all began to come together. And as Miller read through in her file all the names of the people that Susan spent her time with, he noticed something. And finally, it all just clicked. Lieutenant Miller had found the killer. Based on evidence collected at the crime scene and the killer's written confession, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Susan Woods on the evening of Sunday, July 26, 1987. Stephenville's Main Street was busy as the killer drove through town in their brown pickup, sipping a mixture of soda, vodka, and cough syrup. They stared out their window at all the happy people in the restaurants and the storefronts, and as they stared at these people, a darkness stirred inside the killer. This darkness had been there for years, telling the killer they were no good and they would never be close to anyone. Alcohol was the only thing that seemed to make this darkness go away. So the killer stayed half drunk most of the time. But sometimes, even the alcohol wasn't enough. A few years back, when the TV news had been running non-stop with talk about devil worshipping, the killer had been sort of inspired, and they thought they might try that. And so they had lit a bunch of candles and set them around their room in the shape of a pentagram, and then the killer stripped off their clothes, they stretched out on the floor, and they offered up their soul to the devil in exchange for freedom from this darkness. But unfortunately, the darkness remained. And so now, the killer, feeling very riled up, took another drink and thought of Susan and the way she'd smiled at them the last time they had seen each other. The killer had not had the courage to make a move back then, but now, with this buzz that they had from their drink, they really couldn't see a good reason not to make a pass at Susan. So they turned off the main road and they drove the short distance to Susan's house. In a matter of minutes, the killer was at her door, knocking. Susan opened the door and surprise flashed across her face, but then it softened into a smile and she told them to come on in. Susan told them to get comfortable, and as they sat down on the couch, she went to the kitchen to get the killer a Coke and some snacks. Then she brought them back and she sat down on the couch next to the killer to talk and catch up. And that was when the killer made their move. They leaned in to kiss her. But Susan immediately pulled back, suddenly angry. The killer grabbed her, and Susan slapped them across the face. And right then, the killer exploded. And they lunged for Susan, and they dragged her kicking and screaming to her bedroom, where they would spend hours assaulting her. Finally, when dawn approached and Susan was still barely alive, the killer decided it was time to end this. And so as Susan lay there helpless, they grabbed that white electrical cord and they wrapped it around Susan's neck and they pulled it tight. And for a while, Susan fought, but then she went still. But the killer wasn't satisfied that she was definitely dead, so then while keeping the cord around her neck, they also grabbed a pillow and they pushed it over her head and they smothered her. And then when she really was still, the killer still didn't know if she was actually dead or not. So eventually, they dragged Susan's lifeless body into the bathroom, they filled up the tub, and they dumped her upper half into the water, and the killer held her there until they were certain she was dead. And at that point, the killer let go of Susan and then placed both their hands on the rim of the bathtub, and they used that to push themselves back up, and they walked out of the house. It would take almost 20 years, but that single action of the killer placing their hands on the bathtub did eventually give Lieutenant Miller the killer's identity. He was the younger cousin of Susan's best friend, Cindy Hallmark, and he was one of the members of that roundtable group who supported Susan through her divorce. He had also been at Susan's funeral and helped her friends through the aftermath of her death. The killer's name was Scott Hatley, and just a week before he killed her, he had been hanging out with the members of the round table, and Susan was there. And Susan, who was this, very shy, gentle person, had sort of opened up around this group. She was feeling happier and happier, largely because this group of friends, including Scott, had been so supportive. She really felt like she belonged here and was safe here. And during that meeting amongst the members of the round table, just sort of inexplicably, Susan had looked over at Scott and simply smiled at him. And for that reason pretty much alone, Scott, a week later, had shown up on her doorstep and murdered her. By the time Lieutenant Miller put all of this together, Hatley was 41 years old and was still a free man. And so on June 7, 2006, Miller had him arrested and charged him with Susan's murder. He would ultimately take a plea deal and was sentenced to 30 years in prison, but would only serve 11 years before he was released for good behavior. However, 3 years after Hatley got out of prison, he was found dead inside of his RV from cancer complications. And among his things, investigators would find this handwritten diary where he confessed to Susan's murder. The pages were also filled with references to Satan and demons, and Hatley specifically wrote that some kind of outside presence had been responsible for pushing him to ultimately assault and kill Susan. Rachel Berkheimer was born on January 16, 1984 in Everett, Washington, which is a city that is located 25 miles north of Seattle and sits on the banks of the Puget Sound, which is a large inlet of the Pacific Ocean. At the time of her birth, Rachel's parents, Bill and Denise, already had one child, a daughter named Megan, and so when Rachel arrived, they decided their family was complete. Initially, there was some concern that Rachel could have some health issues because by the time she was 2.5 years old, she still was not talking, and so her parents were concerned she could be deaf. But shortly after they went to a specialist about her hearing, Rachel would say her first words, and then from that point onward, her parents could not get her to be quiet. As a youngster, Rachel had a huge imagination. In preschool, she would pretend her fingers were imaginary friends and she would speak to them during class, often getting in trouble because of this. She also had a prized collection of troll dolls, who she gave very intricate backstories to. By the time Rachel was in grade school, she had developed a keen sense of humor. Specifically, she had the gift of mimicry. She could basically become any of her friends or her family members, and everyone thought it was really funny. In addition to her bubbly personality, Rachel was also a very gifted athlete who was always one of the very best players on her basketball, soccer, volleyball, or track team. All this despite growing to be only 4 foot 11 inches tall. Speaking of her smaller stature, even though she was not self-conscious about it, Rachel did wear 4-inch platform shoes virtually everywhere she went, including just going out to the mailbox. In high school, unsurprisingly, Rachel became very popular. Her father joked that he was her answering machine because her many friends would call the house day and night looking for her. But despite this abundance of friends, Rachel took all of her relationships very seriously. She never forgot anybody's birthday, and she would even sometimes send out these random cards that weren't even on birthdays to her friends and to her family members, just telling them how much she loved them. By 2001, when Rachel was 17 years old and in her 3rd year of high school, it just seemed like she was this amazing person who was destined to live a totally charmed life. However, this would not last. Of all of her friends, Rachel's best friend was an 18-year-old boy named Corey Haynes. She had met him when they were young, and they had quickly become soulmates, at least according to their families. However, their relationship was not a romantic one. It was more of a brother-sister style relationship. They spent nearly all of their time together, and in the rare times they were not together, they could always be found speaking on the phone. In the summer following Rachel's 3rd year of high school, Corey was riding in a car with 3 other students from his and Rachel's school. Rachel was not with them. And at some point, the driver of the vehicle lost control of it and started to flip off the road. And when it finally came to a stop 100 feet away from the road, Corey and one of the other student passengers, a 17-year-old named Levi Whiting, were both unfortunately deceased. When Rachel heard the news about this crash, she fell apart. Not only was Corey literally her best friend in the world, but she was also very close with Levi as well. And so over the rest of that awful summer, Rachel spent most of her time crying in her bedroom, looking at pictures of her and Corey and her and Levi. Her older sister, Megan, would say that Rachel was just beyond heartbroken. It was like all of the joy and happiness that normally characterized her was just gone. Finally, that summer did come to an end, and it was time for Rachel to return to Marysville-Pilchuck High School to begin her 4th and final year. Her family hoped that finally being around some other students again would help heal her and help her move on. But unbelievably, over the course of that school year, 4 more students, all of whom were friends with Rachel, would die. There was a suicide, there was a drowning, a hit and run, and an accidental shooting. It was like the school was cursed. By the second half of that school year, Rachel, like many other students at the school, had become deeply depressed. The trauma of losing so many people close to her had just crushed her spirit. When her grades, which were normally quite good, began to decline dramatically, her parents pulled her from the high school and enrolled her in an alternative high school. They also began sending her to grief counseling. But not long after joining this alternative high school did Rachel drop out, so she did not get her high school diploma. Her parents were not happy about this decision, but they did understand their child's life had been completely disrupted in a catastrophic way over the past year. I mean, the trauma she had experienced already as this young person was more than what most adults would experience in their entire lifetime. And so they honored their daughter's decision to drop out, and they just gave her some space to try to figure out what she wanted to do next. After dropping out of school in the spring of 2002, Rachel got a job at a local pizza and pasta shop in town, but after only a couple of months, she quit. She did pick up some hours babysitting that summer, but for the most part, she spent her time just sitting in her room, alone and sad. Then one day, her father looked at the family's phone bill and saw it was significantly higher than normal. When he reviewed all of the individual charges, he saw there was one that really stood out to him. There were dozens and dozens of collect calls that had been placed from an inmate at a correctional facility. When he confronted his daughter about these calls, she would tell him that yes, she was speaking to an inmate at a correctional facility, and his name was John Anderson. He was 20 years old. He went by Diggy, that was his nickname, and that she and Diggy were in this sort of new romantic relationship. She told her father that she had met Diggy a year earlier at a high school party. This was before he was sent to jail on drug and burglary charges. And he had been very interested in her at the time, but she wasn't interested in him. Despite the rejection, though, Diggy continued to pursue Rachel well after this party, but it wasn't until a year later, when she had dropped out of high school, that she finally decided to give him a shot. Rachel would tell her father that Diggy, despite being a convicted criminal, was very misunderstood. He was actually a very nice guy who just had a troubled past, and that was why he kept getting in trouble with the law. Her father did not approve and was very worried about his daughter, but he wanted to be supportive and felt like he didn't really know the whole situation, and so he just told her, please just be careful. Not long after this father-daughter talk, Diggy got out of prison, and so Rachel, who had spent the better part of the last year shut up in her room, was now suddenly going out all the time to see him and his group of friends. It's important to understand here that Diggy and his group of friends were in reality just a group of petty criminals and drug dealers for the most part. However, they thought of themselves as a full-fledged, organized criminal gang, and they were very proud of it. And they even referred to themselves as the Northwest Mafia, and Diggy was very clearly their leader. Quickly, it became apparent to Rachel's family that a big part of, quote, spending time with Diggy and the Northwest Mafia was partying and doing drugs and drinking alcohol. And so naturally, the parents were very concerned for their daughter, who they felt was really starting to go down the wrong path in life. So over the next couple of months, Rachel's parents and her sister all tried to gently convince Rachel to stop spending so much time with Diggy and his crew because they were a totally bad influence on her. But Rachel was adamant that Diggy and his crew was making her happy, and that right now that was what she needed, that she needed to be around them, that they were really just awesome people, and that you got to trust her. And her family, they didn't trust her. They felt like, maybe she's going through a phase where she wants to date, a bad boy. They didn't really get it, but they also didn't have a way of getting through to her. It seemed like she was just convinced this is what she needed to be doing now, and so they just were kind of at a loss. Then, one day, it seemed like everything had just magically fallen into place. It was on a sunny morning in late July of that year. Rachel's father was outside working on his garden when his daughter, Rachel, suddenly appeared looking happier than she had in a long time. Bill smiled back at her and was like, "What's going on? Why are you so happy?" And she would tell him that she had a plan. She was going back to school and she was going to become a medical technician. And she was just absolutely beaming as she's telling him this news. When she was asked what had brought about this incredible change, she explained that she had recently made a new friend who was encouraging her to do this. She said his name was Maurice Rivas. He was 18 years old like she was, and he was a part of the Northwest Mafia. She told her dad that she had previously interacted with him when she first started seeing Diggy a few months earlier, but she had never really had a real conversation with him. She'd only just kind of waved and said hi whenever they were at gatherings together. But a few days earlier, when she was at a Northwest Mafia party, she and Maurice just kind of happened to find themselves alone, and so they struck up a friendly conversation. And during that talk, Maurice confided in Rachel that he was actually really unhappy and he wanted to leave the Northwest Mafia and he wanted to go back to school since he had actually dropped out of high school as well. And when Rachel heard him say this, she had an epiphany. She realized she felt exactly the way he did. She didn't like being in the Northwest Mafia. She didn't even know why she was in the Northwest Mafia. She didn't know why she was seeing Diggy, and it was like it all clicked for her. And so she confided in Maurice, this guy who she barely knew. She said, "You know what? I feel the same way. I don't want to spend time with these people. I want to go back to school." And so this random conversation they had at this party really immediately bonded them together. It was like they both had been harboring this deep, dark secret, but now only with each other, they could discuss it openly. And it was very liberating for them. And so by the end of this first real conversation they had, the pair had promised each other that they were going to get out of the Northwest Mafia, they were going to go back to school, they were going to clean up their acts, they were going to fix their lives, and they were going to do it together. They were going to support each other and have each other's back. Rachel would even joke with her father that they were already talking about when they went back to school that they would go to senior prom together, although she assured her dad that their relationship was totally platonic. This was not a romantic thing. Bill, her father, had no idea what to say. This was literally the best case scenario. It was the thing her family had been hoping for over these last several months, and it seemed like it was finally happening. And so he told Rachel he was so proud of her. He gave her a big hug and said, "Look, if you need anything, just let me know." And Rachel smiled and she gave him a hug back, and then she turned around and skipped back inside the house. And sure enough, over the next 2 months, Rachel did act very differently. She started very intentionally getting her life back together. She started spending more time at home with her family, and she started going to church with her mom, and she also began reconnecting with some of her older high school friends who had always been a positive influence on her. And so by September of that year, Rachel did seem like she was more or less back to her old happy self. Except there was one element of her life, of her old life, so to speak, that she was not able to shake. And that was her relationship with Diggy. She just could not end it. She had tried to, but apparently he didn't want to break up. And so they fell into this sort of weird on and off again relationship that kept Rachel periodically going back to these Northwest Mafia gatherings. Her family was obviously unhappy about this particular detail, but they did feel confident that given her recent changes, that she would eventually break it off for good with Diggy. And so until that happened, they were actually quietly grateful that her new friend Maurice was also still spending time with the Northwest Mafia. He too was kind of struggling to fully break contact with them. And so the family was thinking, well, yeah, they do need to leave, but for the time being, when they're at these gatherings, at least they'll have each other. On September 23rd of that year, Rachel was invited to a Northwest Mafia get-together, and she did agree to go. Before she left her house, she did not give her family very much information about what she was doing or where she was going. All they knew was that apparently she was going out to see some friends. And so that night, when Rachel did not come back home, her family was definitely concerned about her, but they assumed she must have made plans to stay out at this friend or friend's house for the night. And since she didn't have a cell phone, they couldn't call her to confirm that, and so they just had to wait until the next day to see if she would show up again. But the next day arrived, and Rachel did not show up again, and when her family began calling around to her various friends' houses, both old and new, no one seemed to know where she was. For a couple of days, the family continued to call around town and even drove around town putting up posters, asking people to come forward if they had seen her, but there was no sign of her. And so finally, on September 27th, the family went to police and they officially reported Rachel missing. The police immediately jumped into action, sending out units to scour all corners of Everett, Washington, and the surrounding areas. They also began questioning virtually anyone who was even remotely affiliated with Rachel in hopes they might know something. But despite this really aggressive initial push by police, it led to nothing. Then, out of nowhere, someone very unexpected came forward and gave the police a huge tip. And this tip would ultimately lead police to discover the truly unbelievable story of what happened to Rachel. The following is that story. After leaving her house on the afternoon of September 23rd, the day she told her family she was going to see friends, Rachel made the short drive over to 16-year-old Nathan Lovelace's house. He was going to be the host for that evening's get-together with the Northwest Mafia. When she arrived, Nathan, along with Rachel's good friend Maurice and a 17-year-old named Matthew Durham, were sitting in the living room, and while they waited for more friends of theirs to arrive, Nathan's father suddenly came home. Apparently, he had gotten off work early, and so not wanting to hang out around the prying eyes of a parent, the trio decided it would be better if they just left and spent their night at someone else's house. And so they made their way over to Kevin Jihad's house. Kevin was a 32-year-old, and he owned his own place. When they arrived, they found Kevin, along with 22-year-olds John Whitaker and Jeffrey Barth, and 20-year-old Tony Williams, all sitting around in the living room, just kind of joking around. They're playing video games, they're drinking alcohol, and they're smoking marijuana. Rachel, along with Maurice, Nathan, and Matthew, just took up spots on the couch right near the entrance to the room, and before long, they were joking around and having a good time too. At 4 p.m., Rachel's on-again, off-again boyfriend, Diggy, stormed into Kevin's living room looking furious. Without warning, he punched two of the guys sitting nearest Rachel, and then he pulled out a gun and he began aiming it wildly around the room. And this instantly silenced the group because no one knew what he was on about. And Rachel, who's sitting right near the door, she does not want to be part of this, and she's thinking this has nothing to do with me, and so she decides she's going to get up and kind of slip out and let them deal with Diggy and whatever is going on in here. And so she stands up, trying to be as quiet and small as she can, and she begins edging towards the door. But in order to fully leave the living room and escape this situation, she would need to walk right past Diggy, who was standing in the doorway. And as she got closer to him, about to make that move out of the room, Diggy seemed to notice her, and he put his gun down and he turned to face her, and then he turned his whole body so he was squared up with Rachel as if he was getting ready to fight her. And then Rachel just kind of tried to make herself as small and as timid as she possibly could, and she tried to just slip past him. But right as she did, Diggy reached out with his left hand and he grabbed her scalp, he grabbed her hair, and then he wound up and he blasted her in the face with his right hand. And then with his left, he kind of chucked her back into the room she had just tried to escape from. And then the worst night of Rachel's life would begin. As soon as she hit the floor in that room, she tried to scramble back to her feet, but before she could, she was getting punched and kicked by Diggy and several other of her friends who had just been sitting in the room joking around with her, and then the others who were in the room who were not actively participating in beating her, which included Maurice Rivas. They sat there idly doing nothing while Rachel screamed for their help. When her screams got so loud, Diggy was concerned the neighbors would hear her. One of the idle onlookers in the room, 20-year-old Tony Williams, simply turned the music up to drown her screams out. After a few horrible, violent minutes, Diggy told the others to stop. At which point, he reached down and he grabbed Rachel's hair again and dragged her out of the room, and then he dragged her across the kitchen floor and through a door that led into the garage. Once she was inside the garage, he jammed a dirty sock into her mouth and he covered her mouth over with duct tape, and then he bound her wrists and her body with rope, and then once he was certain she could neither make any noise or go anywhere, he pushed her over so she was laying on her side all bound up, and then he just left. He went back into the house and back into the living room with the others. What Rachel was not aware of was this entire night was a setup. Diggy was furious with her, most likely due to a combination of rage that she had tried to break up with him and just jealousy that she was now showing affection to other men in the group, such as Maurice and a few others. And so Diggy had ordered the other members of the Northwest Mafia to help put her in her place. It was unclear exactly what he meant by this, but all of the Mafia members knew this meant physically harming Rachel in some way, and they agreed to it. Originally, the plan had been to lure her to Nathan's house under the false pretenses of just a normal night hanging out with some friends, and then at some point, Nathan, Matthew, and her close friend Maurice would abduct her and bring her to Diggy for whatever else he had planned for her. But Nathan's dad had come home early before they could enact their plan, and so when that happened, Nathan had to sneak off and privately call Diggy and ask what to do next. And Diggy, who was totally frustrated by this, just said, you know what, bring her to Kevin's house and we will all deal with her when she gets here. So when Rachel sat down on the couch in Kevin's house next to Maurice and her other friends, who she thought she was just enjoying a fun night out with, in reality, they were all acting. They were trying to act like this was just another night and kind of get her off guard so that when Diggy came storming into the room pretending to be mad, which was the sign, they would all attack her. But now that the plan had worked and Rachel had fallen into their trap and had gotten badly beaten up and was restrained and helpless in the garage, Diggy didn't have a plan for what they were going to do next. So instead of doing anything, the 8 guys who had just beaten up and restrained Rachel just simply went back to doing drugs and drinking and playing video games in the living room. Then, a few hours later at 9 p.m., Kevin's girlfriend, Trissa Connor, she came home, and when she did, she entered the house through the garage. And when she saw Rachel laying on the ground, restrained, badly beaten up, her left eye is totally swollen, she ran over to her because, one, she actually didn't know who Rachel was. So this is just a random girl in her garage that's beaten up and restrained. And so she runs over to her, she rips the tape off of her mouth, she pulls the sock out, and right away, Rachel is pleading with her to let her go, she won't tell anyone, and Trissa is totally confused because she really has no clue what's going on. She was not a part of the plan to harm this girl, and so Trissa just instinctively runs into the house. She does not make any contact with the guys in the living room. She goes straight into the kitchen and she gets a knife, and then she runs back into the garage and she begins cutting through all of Rachel's restraints to free her. But before she could finish the job, Diggy apparently had heard the commotion of Trissa coming in and heard her running around the house. And so Diggy comes storming into the garage. He sees what Trissa is doing. He runs over and he grabs her hands and he physically stops her from freeing Rachel. And then he threatens Trissa that he's going to harm her if she lets Rachel go. And so Trissa, Amazingly, at this point, despite clearly seeing something very bad is happening to this girl, instead of continuing to try to fight this and figure out what's going on and maybe try to help this girl, she just gets mad at Diggy and says, "I don't want this in my house. What are you doing? I don't want this girl in my house. You know what? I'm going to call the cops if you don't get rid of her." Meaning, I don't care what you do with her, but I don't want this in my house. I don't want to be involved with whatever this is. And then she promptly begins to leave Rachel alone with Diggy. She starts walking away, and Rachel, she's heartbroken. This was her way out. She was about to be let go, and now Trissa is leaving her behind. And so Rachel's begging her to come back. "Please, you gotta let me go." But Trissa didn't listen. She walked into the house and shut the door behind her. And then Diggy, who was still in the garage, he just immediately turned around. He tied Rachel back up. He stuffed the sock back in her mouth. He taped her shut. And then he went right back into the house and shut the door, leaving Rachel all alone again. But a few minutes later, Diggy would come back, this time with John Whitaker, and the two of them would show up with this black duffel bag, this huge bag. And they walk over to Rachel, who's now whimpering in the corner. She'd kind of pushed herself to the side. And they lifted her up and they forced her small body into this black bag, and then they zipped it shut. And while they did this, Matthew Durham, who had been in the living room, he had gone outside and gotten his red Jeep, and he had backed it up to the closed garage door. And then once Diggy and John had Rachel secured in this bag, they opened the garage door up and they put her in the back of the Jeep and they shut the Jeep's back door. And then Diggy ordered John, along with Matthew and Rachel's friend Maurice, who had just come outside, to just go drive around town with Rachel in the trunk until he, Diggy, figured out what they were going to do next. And so the trio hopped in the red Jeep and did what their leader told them to do. They began driving around Everett with Rachel in the trunk, and this whole time Rachel could clearly hear anything that was said inside of the vehicle, but apparently during this initial drive around, the trio didn't talk. So it's unclear if she understood who was actually with her. But eventually, during this drive around, one of the three young men in the Jeep got a call from Diggy, who told them he had his plan, so come pick him up. At this point, the trio decide, for whatever reason, to just dump Rachel somewhere, basically stash her somewhere in her bag, and go pick up Diggy. And then once they had Diggy, they would go back, they would get Rachel, and then they would figure out what they were going to do. They'd hear the plan that Diggy had in store. And so Matthew drove the red Jeep about 10 miles north of Everett to a quiet cul-de-sac in this suburban neighborhood. And then once the Jeep was stopped, Matthew and Maurice got out and they went around to the back of the Jeep, they opened it up, and they pulled Rachel out of the trunk and they walked her over and put her behind some big tree on someone's front property. Now, it's nighttime, this was not a well-lit up area, and so they thought by putting her behind this tree, she'd be out of sight of the road and, no one would see her. And they also decided that one of them would need to stay back and guard her to make sure she didn't escape or that nobody did accidentally find her. And they decided Maurice would be the one who would stay back and do that. And so after Rachel has been planted behind this tree, Maurice made his way over and he sat down next to her. And then Matthew and John, they just drove off in the Jeep to go get Diggy. And so once the Jeep had driven off, Rachel, who could clearly hear their discussions and she could hear the Jeep pulling off, she knows she is now alone with her good friend Maurice. And so this is her opportunity to plead with him to help her. And so as soon as she hears that Jeep is gone, she starts screaming through her gag on her mouth to try to get his attention, and it worked. Maurice quickly unzipped the bag and pulled her gag off, but he didn't untie her. And right away, Rachel, she is so upset, she's frantic, and she says to Maurice, "They're gonna kill me if you don't get me out of here. You have to free me." And Maurice was just very nonchalant, and he said, "Yeah, I think you're making a big deal about this. You're going to be fine. Just go along with it. It's not a big deal." But Rachel couldn't believe what she was hearing. And so she's saying, "Maurice, don't you get it? They are going to kill me. This is the chance. Let me out. Save me. You're supposed to be my friend. Let me go." But Maurice just continued to do nothing. He just kept telling her it wasn't a big deal. She was blowing this up out of proportion. And then at some point, Rachel, after quite a bit of time had passed, and now she's thinking, Diggy and the others, they're going to be back soon. And so she says to Maurice, "You know what? If they're going to kill me, I just don't want to be drowned. I'm terrified of being drowned. At least make them shoot me. Make it quick." And at this, Maurice just doesn't say anything. And instead, he reaches down and he grabs the sock and he puts it in Rachel's mouth. He puts the tape over her mouth and then he presses her down into the bag and he zips it shut. and then he waits for Diggy and the others to come back. And sure enough, just a couple of minutes later, Matthew, John, and Diggy returned in the Jeep to the cul-de-sac. They got out and they lifted Rachel up inside of the bag and they brought her back over and put her in the trunk of the Jeep, which now contained 4 new shovels. And then once the trunk was shut, all 4 men piled inside as well, and then Diggy told Matthew to head out to a particular off-roading spot he was familiar with. It was about 30 miles to the northeast. And over the course of this hour-long drive, Rachel could hear everything being said inside of this Jeep, and she would have heard all the details of exactly what Diggy had planned for her. And so she knows what's going to happen to her, but she can't do anything about it. She's just bound in the back of this Jeep. And so around midnight, they reached their destination, this off-roading site, which was basically this thick forest at the foot of a mountain near a small pond. And once they parked, the men got out, leaving Rachel in the trunk with the trunk shut, and they began walking around the back of the vehicle and started looking on the ground until Diggy said he had found a spot that he really liked, and it was about 10 or 15 feet behind the vehicle. And so once this spot was identified, the men walked back to the Jeep, they opened up the trunk, and they left Rachel, but they pulled out their shovels. Diggy, John, and Matthew, they all took their shovels and walked to this designated spot on the ground, and they began digging, but Maurice didn't. He stayed back at the Jeep, standing right against the trunk with Rachel right behind him. So again, he has this opportunity where, in theory, he could help Rachel, but while she whimpered behind him and tried to get his attention and tried to get him to help her, he just ignored her, and he pulled out a cigarette and he began smoking, and he also had a soda that he was drinking. And so he's just standing there doing nothing. And at some point, Diggy looks up and notices this, and he yells at Maurice to come help them, get your shovel and start digging. And so Maurice, reluctantly, puts a cigarette out, throws a soda can away, and then he grabbed the last remaining shovel, and then he walked away from Rachel and the Jeep over to this site, and he began to dig as well. For the next 30 minutes or so, Rachel, who's still in the trunk is open, she's still in the bag, she's forced to listen to the sound of these 4 people dig what sounds like a very sizable hole. And then when they finally stopped digging, she heard them chuck their shovels aside and start walking back over to her. And when they reached her, they unzipped the bag and they pulled her out and they sat her down on the back of this Jeep. So she's kind of sitting, looking in the direction of this dig site. And as they begin cutting off her restraints and removing the tape from her mouth, she gets a clear view of what they had been digging, and she knows immediately what it is. They were digging her grave. After all the restraints and everything was off of her, Diggy ordered John to start taking all of her clothes and jewelry off. Rachel knew at this point she was about to die. There was nothing she could do to stop it. She was outnumbered. She was in the middle of nowhere. She would have been overpowered. So she knows she's going to die. And so she had nothing to lose. And so when John grabbed her and tried to rip her clothes off, she fought back aggressively. And she looks at Diggy and she says, "At least allow me the dignity of removing my clothes and jewelry myself." And so Diggy looks at her and he says, "Fine." And so all of the men back up. And then Rachel, in front of these 4 people who earlier that day she would have considered her friends, she began taking all of her clothes off. And then after she had removed all of her clothes and all of her jewelry, she left one ring on her hand, and she clutched it with her other hand, and she looked at Diggy and said, "Can I please just keep this one?" The ring she was holding on to was a ring that her good friend Corey Haynes had given her right before he was killed in that car accident. And Diggy just says, "No." And he reaches out and he literally pulls it off of her hand. And so standing there completely naked and alone and terrified, Rachel was then ordered by Diggy to start walking towards the grave. And so Rachel, with as much grace as she could muster, stood up straight, took a deep breath, and began walking. And then she finally reached the edge of the grave, at which point Diggy told her to walk down inside. And so Rachel very carefully turned around and lowered herself down into the grave, and then she stood up in the middle of the grave with her back to her attackers, at which point Diggy said, "Get on your knees." And so she did this, and as soon as she was down on her knees, she looked skyward and she pressed her hands together and put them right up against her chest, and she began praying. And as she's looking upward towards the sky, Diggy laughs at her and says, "Don't worry, you'll be up there soon." And then Diggy pulled his gun out, he aimed it at her back, and he began firing the gun. And he shot several times into the back of her head, into her back, and then his gun jammed, at which point he cleared the jam, he reloaded his gun, and then fired even more shots into her body. And then he put his gun away, and he, along with the other 3 men who had just witnessed this and participated in this, used their shovels to fill the hole back in, covering her up. Once she was buried, the men rounded up all of her things, along with the shovels and the murder weapon, and they chucked it into the nearby pond. Diggy made sure to crush the ring Rachel had said was so important to her before he threw it into the water. Then the men climbed back into the red Jeep and they drove back to Everett. And on the ride, Diggy would tell them that if they told anyone about what they had just done, he would kill them too. But just a few days later, after Rachel had been reported missing, the mother of Jeffrey Barth. Jeffrey was someone who had been at Kevin Jihad's house on the night Rachel was abducted, and he also played a role in her capture. His mother, Jeffrey Barth's mother, behind his back, went to police and told them that she thought her son knew something about Rachel's disappearance. And so the police, they rushed to Jeffrey and they interviewed him, and he would quickly say, "Oh, I don't know anything, but you should talk to Matthew Durham." Matthew, if you remember, was the driver the night Rachel was killed. He also helped dig her grave and he witnessed her murder. And when police spoke to Matthew, at first he refused to speak and tried to act tough, but when the police ratcheted up the pressure, he cracked and he told them everything, including where to find Rachel's body. And as soon as it became clear the police had Rachel's body, every other member of the Northwest Mafia who had been involved in Rachel's murder rushed to speak with the police because they were all trying to save themselves by blaming the other people in the group. And so that is why we have such a clear picture of exactly what happened to Rachel in her final moments, because those responsible told the police everything. During their trials, all 8 of the accused Northwest Mafia members were smug and did not take responsibility for their actions. But the worst of all of them by far was Diggy. During his trial, he smiled, and he even repeatedly turned around to look at Rachel's family so he could laugh at them and wink at them. Ultimately, all 8 of the accused were found guilty of various charges ranging from rendering criminal assistance all the way up to first-degree murder. 16-year-old Nathan Lovelace, whose home was supposed to be the site of the kidnapping, was sentenced to 116 days in jail. 20-year-old Tony Williams, who turned the volume of the music up to drown out Rachel's screams, and who also got the duct tape for Diggy when he was restraining Rachel in the garage, he received slightly more than 9 years in prison. 22-year-old Jeffrey Barth, who played a large role in subduing and kidnapping Rachel, and whose mother had gone to police and tipped them off about what had happened, he received 10 years in prison. 18-year-old Maurice Rivas, who was Rachel's closest friend in the group and who had pledged to support her and have her back as they got their lives together, he was sentenced to nearly 26 years in prison for assisting in Rachel's abduction and helping dig her grave. 17-year-old Matthew Durham, who drove the Jeep that carried Rachel to her death and who also helped dig Rachel's grave, he received 26 years in prison. 32-year-old Kevin Jihad, who was determined to have masterminded the finer details of the abduction and the murder, he was sentenced to nearly 37 years in prison. 22-year-old John Whitaker was sentenced to life in prison for being directly involved in the entire abduction and murder process. And 20-year-old John Diggy Anderson, the leader of the Northwest Mafia and Rachel's ex-boyfriend, he was also sentenced to life in prison for his role in her murder. Throughout Rachel's horrible ordeal, there were many people who could have stepped in and stopped what was happening to her, most notably Trissa Connor, who was Kevin Jihad's girlfriend and who found Rachel tied up in the garage, and Maurice Rivas, who was alone with Rachel in that cul-de-sac and could have easily freed her, but didn't. As a result of these heart-wrenching details, Rachel's family and their legal team worked very hard to pass a bill called SHB 1236. This bill makes it a criminal offense in America if you do not summon assistance for a person that has suffered substantial bodily harm. They are hoping this will save at least one person from suffering unnecessarily. Today, the Berkheimer family is still grieving the loss of their Rachel. However, her father, Bill, takes solace in a particular photograph the police showed him. After Rachel's gravesite was discovered and her body was removed from it, the police took a photo of the grave itself. And in this photo, you can see an imprint in the soil of Rachel's hands where she fell after she was shot. And it looks like her hands were pressed together near her chest, meaning she was likely praying in her final moments on Earth. And Bill likes to believe that means she was at peace when she finally died.